Good afternoon. My name is John Reiskind. I'm this year's president of the Florida Free Speech Forum. Welcome to the September 13th meeting of the Florida Free Speech Forum. We're so glad you have joined us and are present, and we're happy to record this session, which will be available to our listeners and viewers at home from our website. We meet the second Monday of each month, September through May, with presentations at noon. Our forum does not endorse candidates, nor does it take sides on issues other than the critical issue of exercising our right to free speech, and to that mission we are committed with a passion. Our guest speakers will share with us their knowledge for about 30 minutes, after which we have another 30 minutes to ask them questions. It is the responsibility of all of us to be respectful to our guests and to all questioners. We ask that questioners not endorse particular candidates or issues, simply ask questions that can help us all to learn more about our speaker and our topic. Paul Hargrave, our program chair, usually introduces our speaker, but he is out of town, so I'll have that pleasure. Today we have Richard MacMaster, who is a retired professor of American history. He was a product of Fordham University, where he got his bachelor's degree and his master's degree, and then went on to Georgetown University to get his doctorate. He taught American history at Western Carolina University and James Madison University, and he eventually focused on the 18th century America after initially studying the period of Andrew Jackson, the influence of one of his well-known professors at Fordham University. And his name is well known to many, and his name was Robert Rimini, to recognize. His most recent book is titled Scotch-Irish Merchants in Colonial America, the Flaxseed Trade and Immigration from Ireland, 1718 to 1775. That got him very interested in immigrants. He came to Gainesville with his wife, Eve, who is the pastor of the Emmanuel Mennonite Church here in Gainesville, in 2001, and has been an advocate for a variety of local issues involving immigrants, from farm workers to asylum seekers to efforts to make our community a truly welcoming one. Today, he will be speaking on the immigration crisis. What can one community do? Welcome, Dr. MacMaster.
Well, it's good to be here and to join with you. How do we get to this picture?
This is fine.
Should I be speaking into it or?
No, that's fine.
Okay, good. So I was going to talk this morning or this afternoon about the immigration crisis and what can one community do? What can one community do to respond? And I'm going to take a little time here to build up where this crisis came from, and then go on to see what we have been doing in Gainesville and what we can still do and perhaps ought to do. I'm going to rely on my wife if I'm slipping under, that she will remind me that, oh, nobody can hear you way in the back there. I hope you can hear me back there, all right. Okay, good. So This week, incidentally, is designated as Welcoming Week by the National Welcoming America organization. And there will be some events here in town next weekend. But the idea there is that Americans should be welcoming people from all over the world, because as in the past, so in the present, they bring strength to our existing communities that has really enabled us to be the society we are today. So, where did this crisis come from? Well, let's just look at a few figures. In the month of July of this year, the Border Patrol had what they call slightly over 200,000 contacts. Now, since some of these people were people who were deported, sent back across the border, and came back again, so there was some duplication, we're talking about at least 150,000 people a month arriving at the southern border, yes, in that 1 month, seeking to come across the border. Now that goes up and down depending on the months of the year and depending upon the lure of economic opportunity on this side of the border. This is in the numbers. Yes, that's grounds perhaps for a crisis. There is also the question of the fact that most of these people on the southern border of the United States in this summer, as in recent years, are people coming from Mexico and Central America, often indigenous people, Mayans and other groups who have been forced off the land. And one can say, well, this is the typical racist response of Americans that, yes, it's a crisis because we don't want brown and black people coming into our country more than we already have. And as a former president suggested, would we have a different attitude if we had 150,000 tall, blonde Norwegians waiting to cross the border? Well, that's another possibility, but it's also an international crisis. You may remember in 2015, the euphoric scenes when Angela Merkel and the German people responded to the flow of refugees, war refugees from Syria, by welcoming fully 1 million refugees into Germany. But very soon, nation after nation, even those in the European Union that had committed to open borders between countries, suddenly were militarizing their borders, putting up walls and fences, sending troops to prevent refugees from coming across. And the European Union made an agreement with Turkey that resulted in Turkey having to house over 4 million more refugees, mainly from Syria, some also from Afghanistan and Iraq, in camps inside Turkey. And that gave us those scenes that again are indelible of little children washed up on the shore because their inflatable boats were incapable of getting them safely to land. But I think there's a deeper basis for the crisis, and that is that the wider context, that restrictions on borders around the world are ways of putting the poor people of the world, forcing them to stay where they started, while we open the world to global commerce. Borders everywhere are open for corporations, capital, and consumer goods, but closed for workers and regulators. And this has led to dramatic inequalities in wealth and opportunity within individual countries and on a global scale. Workers in the United States and other wealthy countries have seen stagnating wages, loss of benefits, and the closure of many factories. Workers in poorer countries have seen the arrival of new jobs, but these jobs are unregulated in workplaces that offer minuscule wages, no benefits or job security, and dangerous working conditions. Thus, a dressmaking company is free to move from the garment district of Manhattan to center its manufacturing in Nicaragua or in Malaysia. But if the people who work in those factories want to come to the United States, then they really don't have much opening to do so. So this, I think, it's that broader context that suggests why this is a worldwide crisis and something that no one seems to want to deal with. While we were all touched by the scenes of desperate people trying to get to the airport in Kabul, really no country wants to take unlimited numbers of refugees, even people who had worked with their own governments or with their own military while they were in Afghanistan during the 20-year occupation. So, if I might look back a little bit on American immigration policy, we can see that the first federal immigration policy came only 100 years after the Declaration of Independence. It was left entirely to the states until 1876. And very quickly, we established what our pattern was going to be with the adoption of a Chinese Exclusion Act and similar legislation that protected what was assumed to be a white European Protestant society in the United States. And this continued, this particular trend continued and culminated perhaps in legislation adopted in 1924 when quotas were set, quotas that were so heavily weighted in favor of immigrants from the British Isles and from Western Europe on the grounds that this was our American stock, and weighted against immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and to the total exclusion of immigrants from Asia and Africa. We remember 1924 as being a particularly dim year in immigration history, but it's striking that when there was a new Immigration Act in 1952, what did they do? They reenacted all of those quotas. They were still anxious to keep out undesirables, and that lasted until 1965. It was only in 1965 that those quotas were finally abolished and a different set of quotas set up for a more equitable distribution of visas. Now, in those years, after the Second World War, we also dealt for the first time with a category known as refugees. In 1946, there was the Displaced, what were they called? Displaced Persons Act that enabled large numbers of people to come and settle in this country. We had failed miserably to help people who were fleeing Nazi persecution before the war. And now we were looking to welcome people. But very quickly, the Cold War ethos took over, and all of the subsequent refugee bills, and they were all separate bills, down to 1980, were all skewed in favor of people who were fleeing communism rather than people who might be fleeing from persecution or oppressive governments of a different kind. The 1980 Refugee Act created the category of refugee in American law as someone who was fleeing a reasonable expectation of persecution because of their religion, their ethnicity, their political opinion, and excluded actually people who might be coming for any kind of economic reason. It also created the category of asylum seeker. And an asylum seeker is someone who would qualify as a refugee, but who is either already in the country or is on the border, and then they would be allowed to come into the country and await a hearing to establish their claim, whereas refugees are vetted outside the country and then brought in after a long process. So this continued until really the not 1880s, the 1980s, when we had the first legislation that was moving in the direction, and this is a very important direction, of criminalizing immigration. That there is a bill passed in 1986 that provided, it was actually an amnesty bill. It provided a road to citizenship for persons who had come here without a visa, mainly from Mexico, and that there was a way that they could rectify their situation. But to balance it, they, for the first time, introduced the idea of penalizing employers who hired undocumented immigrants on the grounds that these employers were encouraging people to come across the border. Now, that has always been a non-starter. You may remember just recently in the Florida legislature that they had a bill that would have required the use of the automated system E-Verify to determine whether you were in fact an American citizen or not, before we could hire you. And every single industry of any significance in Florida campaigned vigorously against that. So when the bill was finally passed, it applied only to categories of state employees. So it would be virtually meaningless. But that was not going to be the way this would proceed. So in the 90s, we moved to I'm going to run a couple of minutes. Well, actually, we started a little bit after 5 after. In the 90s, we began to move full throttle toward a criminalization of immigration, and these came with a bill in 1994. Let me see if I have that. Sorry, I'm going to look back here. Yeah. I just want to get the title of that. The passage, and it was 1996, I'm sorry, of the Illegal Immigrant Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. Now, what this did was to mandate, and again, in balancing an amnesty of sorts for people who are already in the country. This mandated the hiring of greatly increased numbers of Border Patrol people, and insisted that there should be an automated verification process to establish the citizenship of job applicants. Well, that didn't particularly go anywhere, but the vastly increased funding allowed the Border Patrol to change from an operation that had a fairly small group of agents in any one place into a 400,000 man operation. And at the same time, there was the beginnings of the private prison industry, so that private corporations were building prisons, and in many cases, when they couldn't find that the state wanted to take this over or let them operate it for them, they presented themselves as immigrant detention centers. So through the 90s, we moved, as I say, into this idea that crossing the border was a criminal offense. Down to 1965, there were no visas required. You could go from St. Stephen, New Brunswick to Calais, Maine. You could go from El Paso to Juarez every day. You want to go shopping? Maybe you had work in one place and you lived in the other, no problem. 1965, you had to have a visa, but over the next 30 years, there wasn't very much in the way of enforcement because it was impossible for the Border Patrol to do that. But in order to encourage Congress to keep giving them more money, the Border Patrol in the mid-90s had two demonstration plots. One was at El Paso and one was at San Diego, where they concentrated as many agents as they really could and built fences. And they proved that with that method, you could bring crossings, certainly undocumented crossings, down to practically zero. But what they did, and this became a deliberate policy, was then to steer the immigrants and the people traffickers into the very dangerous and often deadly crossing of the Arizona desert. And that was supposed to deter immigration. We'll have no further problems. 1994 had also been a very significant year. That was the adoption of NAFTA. And one of the things that NAFTA provided was not just the free movement of corporations, capital, and consumer goods, but of agricultural products, so that American corn could be effectively dumped on the Mexican market. And someone had the rather naive idea that if we forced Mexican farmers, poor small campesinos, to grow something other than corn, because they couldn't sell it on the local market and make a profit there for any surplus they had, they would raise more lucrative crops and they would decide to stay at home. Whereas the opposite occurred, you simply depopulated areas where people would say, there's no way we can continue to live here. And that drove great waves of immigration to the United States. And then again with post 9/11, 9/11, we had a massive change in immigration that now really made it a felony to cross a second time into the United States and fed vast numbers of people into detention centers. And more recently, we've had a kind of war on asylum seekers and required these people to wait in Mexico, even if they had established a valid claim. Well, I want to say, what can one community do in response? I'm going to run through a quick historical overview here. I think I've got about 5 more minutes anyway. In 2010, we formed the Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice. This grew out of the fact that there had always been some campus activity supporting farm workers, and especially the immokalee growers, tomato growers, workers there over the years in the coalition of immokalee workers. It was the idea of Jeremiah Tattersall and Sheila Payne that churches probably would be around, whereas student groups come and go because they graduate, the leaders leave. So Kimberly Hunter, who was a member of our congregation at Emmanuel Mennonite, organized Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice. We worked to get numerous churches and synagogues and mosques engaged in this. And we were concentrated largely on farm workers for the first few years. And then inevitably, it became an advocacy for things like DACA in 2012, and for protecting, we had a lot of work with this, protecting the DACA students, the undocumented students at UF and Santa Fe, and there were quite a few, and to campaign against a bill in the Florida legislature that would have penalized anyone who was not an American citizen by requiring them to pay international student rates in a Florida university, even though they had lived in fact, even though they were born in the United States and were American citizens, if they had undocumented parents. So that was we did that kind of advocacy for quite a while. And then in 2015, well, actually, let me pick up another thread there. But one of the things that had been suggested was that this advocacy is fine, but it's always at arm's length. We needed something that was going to be more hands-on. And a lady in her name I no longer know, in First Methodist, came up with the idea that when she lived in New York, they had supported people who were going to their immigration hearings by a presence in court. Well, the immigration court is in Orlando, so that was quite a non-starter. But thinking about that, and this led Joan Anderson, who was the spearhead then of this, to say, yes, but there is a detention center in McClenny, Baker Detention Center, and we could be a presence visiting those people and getting their stories and just letting them know that people on the outside were concerned. And Joan has, from about 2014, I guess, that has continued until COVID shut it down. But we've been able to assist people who are released. They decide they don't have to be deported, and they will turn up in Jacksonville bus terminal with just the clothes on their back and maybe not enough money to get the bus to go to home, wherever their home is. So that's continued. And we also spun off Welcoming Gainesville and Alachua County as an idea of making the community have the sense that, yes, we want to welcome people. It's not just something there. And that took a while to get, for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into. That took a while to get practical implementation. The one thing we were able to do was to create English conversation partners, but it was left for Fran Ricardo and Robin Louie of Rural Women's Health Project to say, let's get some real teeth in this in the city, and let's get some money set aside for language availability. So maybe you can get by in a little bit of English, but it's not your first language, and it would be good to be able to say, yes, we have ways of signage and so on and so on, and several other things. So they've been doing a great work with that. And then finally, I'm with you, just let me finish this one point. Then finally, in a few years ago, Laura Robertson Coleman, a lady who lived in Memphis, Tennessee, who was concerned about this kind of war on asylum seekers, discovered that, you know, while the then president was saying, and it's been upheld by the Supreme Court, sadly, that if you have a valid claim, you have to go back and nobody is going to take care of you. You're charged on public charity. You're living in some squalid camp, and you may have to wait years before we get around to giving you a full hearing. That if, or we send you off to detention, that if you had a sponsor if somebody in the United States would say, yeah, wait a minute, I want to make sure that this family don't have to do that. I will say I am their sponsor. They will show up for all of their ICE meetings and all of their immigration hearings. They're not going to disappear. And then they can come and live anywhere in the United States. So she created a program then that's the Asylum Seeker Sponsorship Program. And we are working very seriously on getting sponsors. It was Ginny Campbell from our church who ran into this. That's interesting. And she was quite prepared to do something with it. And well, would other people be interested? And so we're really at this point about, we hope this fall, to get a family rescued from the border and bring them to Gainesville. And then of course they're free to live anywhere. If they have cousins in Milwaukee, they can go to Milwaukee. But we would still have that responsibility for them. And this is a program that we're seriously pushing because, yes, advocacy is helpful. Yes, it's good to write to Congress, but somehow or other, let's get our hands on this. We're only going to help 1, 2, 3 people, but 3 people are more than no people. So what can a community do? Well, that's something. And now if you would like to have some questions, I'm ready to listen.
Here, and we will arrange this. I want to thank you very much for your presentation. The history was invaluable and the response was enlightening. I know several of you have questions, and so if you have a question, come up here. We'll get you on screen. I wanted to start out by just asking a little more about some terminology. For a while, we were hearing about sanctuary cities versus, say, welcoming cities. Could you clarify that and tell us a little bit about whether the laws and the policies of recent administrations in that regard?
Yeah, sure. The sanctuary movement was started back in the 1980s, and it was to shelter people who were refugees from the wars that were going on with American weapons in Central America. And here it was individuals would be protected mainly by churches and synagogues, that they would be responsible for them. They would, and this was revived. I can't put a definite date on it, but this was revived with the idea of offering sanctuary to individuals who were at risk of being deported, people who were undocumented, but who might be deported. And that initially was limited then to local congregations and whatnot, but it spread to several cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, all said, we are going to be a sanctuary for undocumented immigrants. And that, of course, took a lot of fire from government. We had a bill in Florida to outlaw sanctuary cities. There are no sanctuaries, there never were. any sanctuary cities in Florida. It was confined really to some pretty powerful municipalities that didn't have to worry about being overawed by some federal statute. And what about welcoming cities? This is a purely what's the word I want there? Yeah, it's a voluntary thing that we're trying to say that this county, this city, is a place that really welcomes and values immigrants of all kinds. It had its really original strengths in Rust Belt cities like Detroit, where goodness knows if you would come and move to our city, we want you because we've got miles of empty houses and whatnot. So I hope that's a little clarification.
Thank you very much. We have a question from, just state your name and ask your question.
Kirsten Plamond, and I appreciate your words so much. Before I ask my question, I wanted to say thank you to all of you who agreed to come today. I don't know if we are the intrepid few supporters of free speech in the world, or if we're all just foolish and we should have stayed home. I don't know, but thank you. And because we have some extra delicious food to take home, I've asked our caterers to dish up packets to take home with you. So if anybody wants to walk by the table on the way home, he's dishing up some plates so that you can, it's like Thanksgiving dinner. It's like Thanksgiving. You go to Thanksgiving and then you take a plate home.
Yes.
So feel free. Okay, so my question is, as a former school teacher, I'm very interested in DACA. And I wonder if you've kept up with the situation in Alachua County. Do you know if we still have DACA students, if they're feeling safe, what the situation is at this point?
Oh yeah, of course we have DACA students, well at every level, because the program is still in existence. It was greatly threatened for a while, and it may yet be knocked out by the Supreme Court. We don't know. And if I were a DACA student, I would be somewhat nervous about my future. But there are a lot of students at every level, and they really need community support. Is that a question coming, or?
It is, but take your time in answering the first.
No, that's fine. Come right in.
Just to see if there are any. No, okay. Yes, state your name and ask your question.
My name is Dr. AJ Jung. I'm at UF and first time here. Very impressive. Thank you so much. One of my questions has to do with how we change some of the narrative about immigration in the US. I hear from a lot of people, it seems that they've lost a sense of their own ancestors as immigrants. And they see their families having done everything right. There's no sense of the struggle that caused the reason for their ancestors to move or any of that sort of thing. How do you think we can increase the recollection, the reality of most Americans' history of immigration, and at the same time connect those to the stories of people experiencing those difficulties today?
Very good. A quick answer is that it always amazed me that people who until 1965 would have been totally excluded from coming to this country, but who then followed the, as they would say, the legal process and were settled here, that their children were often the most outspoken people in the legislature. It wasn't people who said, well, you know, we've been here since 1620. We don't want any of these other people. It was people who were saying, well, yeah, my dad came here and from India, perhaps, and he did everything right. So why can't they do it? Well, they can't do it because of the enormous numbers and the enormous backlog that they can't quite get that. So how do we get people to see their own story? It's something that can be done in every group. We tried it a couple of times with dinners and whatnot, but the most interesting one was something that Rabbi David Kamen came up with at B'nai Israel, where they had an evening where people told the story of how did my great-grandfather come to this country, and what did he have to suffer in getting here, and that would give you hopefully a somewhat different thought about, well, yeah, just send them back to camps and so on. So.
Are there any additional questions? I'd like to ask a general one, and how we can get involved, how we can help the efforts locally. What would you recommend?
Well, Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice meets on the second Monday via Zoom. This being the second Monday, we're meeting tonight at 6 o'clock. And if you want to give me your email, I can send you the Zoom link when I get home. I can't do it here. And we'll be talking about a number of these issues tonight, and we'd be very happy to have your input. And if you just want to contact, well, you could contact me at rmacmast@ufl.edu. I can put you in contact with the different programs. As I say, we particularly would like people who could volunteer for the English conversation partners. That's something you do in your own time, having made the contact with a person from another country who wants to improve his or her English. So that's an opportunity, and we really would love to have you think about sponsoring an asylum seeker. That's something. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. MacMaster. Very interesting. I want to point out that we are going to ask you all here and those who are listening to this recording to join us in person or online for the next meeting of the Florida Free Speech Forum on Monday, October 11th, when our guest speaker will be Kim Barton, the Alachua County Supervisor of Elections. Lots to talk about when it comes to elections and procedures. If you wish to comment on today's meeting or to offer suggestions or to get help in Zooming, which I think we all need, please email us at floridafreespeechforum@gmail.com. For more information about the forum, please visit our website, Florida Free Speech Forum, one long word, .org. And be sure to tell your friends to join with us next meeting. I want to thank you all for coming. And the Florida Free Speech Forum is now adjourned. Hmm.
Yeah, I can absolutely see you. I'll be back. We'll do boxes for whoever wants them, and then everything else can go through.